Welcome to Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk. This program is an outpouring of the ministry going on at Calvary Chapel, Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
Persia would be launching their major invasion against Greece. So it's only a few short years until that happens. During the time of this book, during these 10 years, is when the king, Xerxes, goes up against Persia and loses during the reign of Esther. All of these great historic events you've read about in school happened during this reign. So it's a major time period in geopolitics for the whole world. And that is when God chooses to raise up the story of Esther.
The world around us always has something crazy happening. Whether it's war, a natural disaster, or sometimes it's just drama in our own lives. This world sets us up for failure. Today, Pastor Dan says the story of Esther was set when there was war and chaos all around. God has a plan for you, just like Esther. Even if the world's in chaos, God has a plan for you. He's constantly on the move and planning your next step. If you trust and follow Him, know He's planning great things for your life. His way is better. Now turn in your Bible to the book of Esther chapter 1, as Pastor Dan begins his message, always setting the stage.
The book of Esther. So let's just open this up by discussing a little bit about what the book is, why the book is here. The title of the message is always setting the stage. So, I think when you say the book of Esther, there's not a ton of Old Testament stories that the church really has a great idea of. The moment you say the name of the book of Esther, oh, I know what that is. And we very often go in our heads to the climax of the book, to that great conclusion when Esther goes before the king. And that's the great conclusion to the book. And there's so many lessons there of God's providence and her faith and courage and all of those things. But interesting, before we can get to those things, we have these 3 chapters that set the stage for that to even come to pass. And I want to intentionally ask you today to think about how many chapters there are in the book of Esther before we even get to the problem that this book is going to solve. There are people, there are places, there are things in this book that God sets up that have to happen to be able to get to that place where we can see the providence of God to deliver the Jews, where we can see Esther's great courage and boldness and faith in God. There are things that need to be set up first. So who's the author of this book, Esther? Well, we know it had to have been a Jew closely related to the affairs of the palace, but also a Jew. It had to be a Jew. So Mordecai is likely who we're going to find is Esther's cousin. I think so many times we read these stories and it says that he was her uncle. Cousin is the best translation of these words here in the book. So at this time, set the stage on where we're at. Now we've just come through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and we talked in those books about these 3 waves of times when Jews returned back to the land after the Persian kingdom began to allow them to go back. They first started to go back under Zerubbabel and Joshua around 536 BC, and then years later, in the second half of the book of Ezra, is when Ezra himself led the next wave of people back, right? Well, where Esther takes place is after that first wave of return under Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua, and before Ezra, the priest, came back to Israel. So that's the time period where this is at. So what's happening in Israel at the time that Esther starts? Well, we've got the altar in Jerusalem has been rebuilt under Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest, but they haven't rebuilt the temple. The entire temple. They haven't rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem or the city, and they've only got maybe 30 or 40,000 Jews that have returned back to Israel. Now, there are more scattered in lots of different places, but that's the conditions at the time when this book is written. So please remember that. This basically takes place after Ezra chapter 6, but before the man Ezra comes on the scene in Ezra chapter 7. So this account takes place in just a few 10-year period of time, around 480 483 BC until 473 BC is when this takes place. The theme of Esther really centers around you could put it in a question. Do you have faith to be a part of God's providential plan and be blessed for it? Do you have the faith to be a part of his plan? See, when we read the story of Esther and Mordecai, it's not just the story of what they did. It's also the encouragement for us to do the same and be a part of the same blessing that they were a part of. So God is always trying to set the stage of our life, and today we get to see the stories of how he set the stage in their life. God is orchestrating. When you think of orchestra, what do you think? Many pieces, right? Many different things that have to come together. That is a great way to look at this. God is orchestrating many more pieces into our life and out of our life than we can even imagine. You think of just the people, the events, the places that come in and out of our life at any given time. This is the idea. This is what God's doing. There's many things that he's moving around. So that's why I've titled this message on the first couple chapters of Esther as Always Setting the Stage. God is always setting the stage for what is to come and to ultimately fulfill his plan. God is involved with us, and ultimately it's because he cares about us as individuals. He wants to give us chances to shine, opportunities to show our faith and trust in him. That's what he's doing. He's setting up things for us to have a chance, have an opportunity to glorify him. So we're going to look at 3 ways today that God sets the stage of our life to accomplish in us his purposes. So it's a very easy outline for tonight. Chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. 3 separate chapters, 3 separate points. Chapter 1, the first point we're going to look at is that for setting the stage of our life, oftentimes God has to move pieces out of our life. Has that ever happened to you? Whether it's a person, a place, a thing, something had to get moved out of your life before you could move on to the next thing, to the place that God wanted you to be. Unfortunate as it sounds, there are sometimes things that come into our life that are hindering, that are holding back. And God will orchestrate the events of our lives to take care of those things. And I believe we see that here in Esther chapter 1. This chapter 1, it's the story of King Xerxes' wife Vashti and his divorce from her. And she gets divorced, and we're going to see later that then Esther comes in to replace her as the queen. Have you ever thought to yourself, why do I have a whole chapter here to open up the book of Esther about this Vashti that used to be the queen? I'm never going to hear from her ever again in the Bible. Why is it here? Have you ever thought that? And I'm telling you, it's because God wants us to see how he's setting the stage. How there's times where there's things that he has to not just bring into your life, there's times that he has to bring things out of your life. And this is step 1. How can Esther rise to the place that she's going to be if this chapter was never here, if this chapter never happened, right? So this chapter 1 is the divorce of Vashti from King Xerxes. We'll get his name here. His name is Ahasuerus, in the Hebrew, in the Greek, it's Xerxes. In the Persian, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but that's probably the way they said it, okay? So we often go by the Greek form of his name, Xerxes, but in the scriptures, you're often going to see the name Ahasuerus because that is his Hebrew name. So Esther chapter 1, it's verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Xerxes, this is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia over 127 provinces. We're going to read an extended section here, verse 2. That in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on his throne, the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants. The power of Persia and Media, that means all of his generals and army, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being all there before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty for many days, even for 180 days, And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all people that were present in Shushan the palace, both small and great, for 7 days, in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where there was white, green, blue hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rings and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon the pavement of red and blue and white and black and marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold. They weren't paper cups. They weren't china. They were gold. Are you getting the flow of this? The vessels being diverse, one from another. They were handcrafted is the idea. And royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law. None did compel. I mean, it was free. You didn't have to. So the king for the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. So, wow, all of these verses, and it's just simply trying to get the thrust out there. Look, after he came home, so in those days, the kings went out to war, right? He's running 127 provinces, or you could say micro kingdoms, underneath him from all over. Did you notice that was from India, the whole way over, and that is modern Pakistan, close to India today, the whole way across the Middle East into Africa. This is what he ruled. In fact, he even ruled up into modern Turkey. He ruled all of what is modern Turkey, his kingdom, right up against modern Greece. He even controlled one or two of the provinces of modern Greece. That's the extent of his kingdom. In fact, he's having conflicts at this point in the reign of the Medo-Persians. They're starting to have conflicts with the Greek city-states, Sparta and Athens and all of those. So, remember the grand scope of things of where we're at. I mean, you had the Egyptian kingdom long ago, under the days of Moses and Joseph that ruled the world. And then you had the Babylonian kingdom just a few years before this. Now you've got the Medo-Persians running everything. After this, the Greeks are going to take over, and then after that, the Roman Empire. See, all through these centuries and centuries, you had a kingdom that pretty much dominated the world until after the days of the Roman Empire. And then things finally split up into nations and states. So he's running 127 sub-kingdoms under this massive rule of his. And all of these verses is just designed to demonstrate the absolute affluence of how great it was. He went out to battle, and then after the king would come back from battle, they would celebrate. They would celebrate a victorious time being out to battle. This is the 180 days. They basically recognized the 180 days and celebrated it, and then they threw this party at the end of the 180 days. I think it's in verse 5. Oh, let's see. Where is it? After the 180 days, what did they do? Show the riches of his glory and his kingdom for many days, even for 180 days. In verse 5, and when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present at Shushan. Does it say the exact amount of days? Maybe it doesn't. Just that they celebrated at the end of that time. If it's there, shout it out to me. But 7, there it is. It's 7. So they celebrated is the point. But look at the affluence of all of the things that they brought out. That's what I want you to not miss. They were drinking from golden cups. This isn't just the king. This is all of his leaders, all of his generals, all of his governors, all of them. And so what a time. This is a major deal. I want to make sure you're not picturing, you and a couple of your buddies out back, in the trailer, kicking back a few drinks. This is not that. This is a major party. This is a big deal showing the amazing control and influence of this kingdom. In fact, it says they were at Shushan, the palace. That's come up several times throughout the different books, from the book of Daniel through Ezra, Nehemiah, and now here in Esther. Shushan was the winter palace of the Persian kings. So they were throwing this party for not just for morale, but also for coordination. He would have gotten together with his generals and planned their next trips. In fact, from this date here in 483 BC, just 2 years after this, Persia would be launching their major invasion against Greece. So it's only a few short years until that happens. During the time of this book, during these 10 years, is when the king, Xerxes, goes up against Persia and loses during the reign of Esther. All of these great historic events you've read about in school happened during this reign. So it's a major, major time period in geopolitics for the whole world. And that is when God chooses to raise up the story of Esther. So take a look here in verse 9. This party is going on. It's a major event. In verse 9, also Vashti, the queen, she made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belongs to the king Ahasuerus. And on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded a list of names. He commanded all of these people, Mehuman, Biztha, and all the rest of them. There was 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king. He commanded them to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. In verse 12 it says, but the queen, Vashti, refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth or angry, and his anger burned within him. Now look, he asked for the queen to come, and it expressly says he wanted to show her off for her beauty. Now look, we can put our bias into that, and we can think that he's thinking something perverted, and then you'll think she's right to defend herself. Or maybe he was saying, look, I'm just proud of my wife, and I want her to come. And maybe it was completely innocent, and she was just offended for no good reason. It could be either one. Now, I've seen commentaries and smart people go way down both of those trails and try to be very, very dogmatic on one or the other. You know, like, oh, the king was asking for something perverted, or, oh, the king, he just simply wanted his wife. We don't know. We don't know. And I think that's interesting, because when it's not clear in the text, what it tells me, and this applies to many things in the scripture, when something like that is not clear in the text, you know what it triggers my mind to think about? I think the Lord wants me to think about another part of the story. It must not be that fact that's that important, or else he would tell me. We don't know if he was asking for something rude or if he was just asking for something simple and benign. But what we know is that Vashti decided to stand up against the king with her life on the line. She decided to stand against the king. Again, we can't be dogmatic whether she was right or wrong on this. She should be so loved of her husband, the king, that she should want to do what her husband asks of her. So in that case, you could say, well, she was wrong for not coming. But she shouldn't be paraded as a symbol of nothing but physical beauty. So if you look at it that way, well, she's perfectly right in refusing such a request. So consider that, think of it this way. We're going to find out that she stands up for this issue. She chooses this issue to live and die about. You ever heard the expression, that's the hill I'm going to die on? Or the opposite, that's not a hill I want to die on. You know what that means, right? It's saying, I choose this issue to go to bat. I am going to jump into this issue no matter the cost. I'm going to take a stand. Well, she chooses this issue to make her issue. Now, what I find interesting about this is that Vashti chooses this issue that seems pretty trivial, and it ultimately, even if she was right, that he was trying to parade her as some sex symbol, it's not going to help anybody but her. This great issue that she decides to stand for is really just to defend self. Whereas Esther, we're going to see her come on the scene. We're going to see her set up as the queen, and she decides to put life on the line to defend many people, many other people. And I believe that that's part of the reason why the Lord has given us this chapter about Vashti. To make the point, here we have Vashti. She decides to stand up to do what? To help herself. That's it. That's the extent of what it's for. I think sometimes we need to endure some trivial issues. We need to endure some trivial things so that we can stick around long enough to actually stand up for something that is going to be super consequential, something that will help other people. You have to wonder, what would have happened had she just stayed around long enough to stand up for an issue that would have helped others? But she doesn't. She decides, this is the hill I want to die on, and she will end up being dethroned and taken out of being the queen because this is the issue she chooses. And so let's continue the story here. Verse 13. Verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner towards all that knew the law and the judgments. And next unto him was all of these men, including, notice the last name in the list is Memucan. He's going to come up later. These were the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat the first in the kingdom. So these were the leaders with the king. In verse 15, what shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to the law? Because she has not performed the commandment of King Ahasuerus by the chamberlains. He sent the chamberlains to get her, and she refused. What should we do? Verse 16. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in all of the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. Memucan is stretching this out. Look, she didn't just wrong you. She could start a trend here by her rebellion, is his counsel. And so it continues and says, for this deed, in verse 17, this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, when it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deeds of the queen, thus shall they arise too much contempt and wrath. So in verse 19, if it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, because that's the custom of the Persian law, and that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. So this is Memucan's counsel, that listen, if you don't deal with this personal issue, then what she did will cause all the women of the land to rise up in rebellion against their own husbands. So the king is supposed to represent all authority. He cannot have his authority refused, right? This is the idea. And they know that idea will spread if they let this go. Now look, maybe the king is making a foolish, drunken request to have her come, but now he's forced to deal with the problem. Now he's forced to deal with the fact that he has anyone in his kingdom refusing him and his authority as king. I think the same thing happens for us. Sometimes we make foolish decisions, and then we have to settle for the consequences. That happens so many times in raising kids that okay, you guys can stay up a couple extra hours tonight, and then the next morning they're miserable and we have to put up with it because we let them stay up like 3 extra hours.
You've been listening to Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk. Today, Pastor Dan has been teaching from the Old Testament book of Esther. The story of Esther is a powerful reminder of God's providence and his ability to work through ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Though God's name is never mentioned in the book, his presence is woven throughout every event, from Esther's rise to being queen, to her courageous decision to approach the king and save her people. Esther shows us the importance of faith and boldness, trusting that God is always at work behind the scenes, even when we can't see him. Her story reminds us that No matter how uncertain or dangerous the situation, God's plans will always prevail, and He invites us to be part of His redemptive work. If today's teaching encouraged you, visit us online at cchambersburg.org to hear more messages like this. Under the Media tab, you'll find an archive of teachings, or you can download our app for easy access to sermons and updates wherever you are. You can also learn more about Calvary Chapel Chambersburg, located in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. If you're in the area, we'd love to have you join us for worship and fellowship. Service times and directions can be found on our website at cchambersburg.org. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and be sure to tune in next time for more valuable insights and biblical truths from the book of Esther. This has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.